Welcome to another episode of the video on The Butcher's Game, how a killer outsmarted his victims, a chilling true crime story. For more video like this, subscribe, like, and share our channel. Life Fact Daily, the mask of normalcy. Every community has its trusted figures. The teacher who inspires children, the doctor who heals the sick, the pastor who offers comfort, and yes, the butcher, the man with the steady hands who provides families with food for their tables. These people become part of our daily rhythm, the ones we trust without question. But trust can be a dangerous illusion. Behind a smile, behind a handshake, behind the simple act of wrapping meat in brown paper, there can exist something far darker. This is where our story begins. In a quiet, unremarkable town, there lived a man known by everyone simply as the Butcher. His shop was a cornerstone of the community. Families visited him weekly, children waved to him through the window, and neighbors swore by his cuts of meat. He was the kind of man people recommended with confidence, dependable, skilled, and trustworthy. But this was all part of his design. Unlike the chaotic criminals who act out of impulse, the Butcher was a strategist. He understood that in order to hunt, he first had to blend in. So he created a version of himself that was flawless. By day, he was generous, handing out small discounts or slipping in an extra cut of meat for free. By evening, he was social, joining neighbors for drinks, always laughing at the right time, never drawing unwanted attention. He was visible enough to be known, but quiet enough never to be noticed too much. This ability to appear normal wasn't luck. It was a skill. Psychologists call it impression management, the deliberate act of shaping how others see you. And the Butcher was a master at it. He wore friendliness like a mask, hiding the darkness beneath. He wasn't just trying to look harmless. He was carefully building trust. Every smile, every nod, every small act of kindness was an investment. Trust, for him, was currency. And once someone trusted him, they belonged to him. His victims never saw him coming, because they couldn't imagine that the man behind the counter, the man who knew their names and remembered their orders, could also be the man who studied them, dissected their habits, and eventually turned that knowledge into a weapon. But the Butcher wasn't reckless. He didn't strike blindly. He waited. He learned. He tested. And only when the moment was perfect did he close in. The true horror of the Butcher is not just that he killed. It's that his victims often walked willingly into his trap, smiling, chatting, believing they were safe, right up until the moment they weren't. This was his first and greatest trick, the mask of normalcy. He understood a chilling truth that many predators know. People fear shadows, alleys, and strangers, but they rarely fear the familiar. And so, by making himself familiar, the Butcher eliminated suspicion before it could even begin. And yet, this was only the beginning of his game. Because once trust was established, the Butcher began the second phase of his plan, studying his victims, who they were, what they feared, and, most importantly, what they lacked. That's where his story turns darker. Predators in nature never rush. A lion waits in the tall grass, watching, patient, silent. A wolf circles the herd, observing, learning, choosing. They don't attack blindly, they select. They wait for the moment when prey is weakest, when escape seems impossible. The Butcher understood this perfectly. To him, murder was not a random act of violence. It was a game of calculation. Every victim was chosen for a reason, and that choice was made after careful, deliberate study. At first glance, he was just making small talk, asking customers about their families, their work, or their health. But beneath the surface, these conversations were nothing short of psychological reconnaissance. Each detail was another thread in the web he was spinning. "Do you live nearby?" sounded like friendly chatter, but to the Butcher it revealed how quickly someone could disappear without notice. "Your husband works nights?" wasn't idle curiosity. It told him who spent long evenings alone. "Your children already grown and moved away?" Wasn't sympathy. It was recognition of vulnerability. Every answer was stored, cataloged, and remembered. He watched, too. He noticed who lingered in his shop long after others had left, who laughed a little too hard at his jokes, who was flattered by his attention, who accepted his offers of help without hesitation. Each interaction became a test, a subtle way of measuring trust and compliance. Some were too cautious. They joked with him politely, but kept their distance. Others were too connected. Family members checked in on them too often, or their schedules were too predictable. These people were quietly removed from his mental list. But then there were the ones who fit perfectly into his design. The widow who carried groceries home alone. The factory worker who often walked back late at night. The single mother who trusted him because he gave her discounts. These were the people who carried invisible weights, loneliness, financial struggles, the longing for someone to notice them. And the butcher noticed. He noticed everything. This stage of his process was not about force. It was about patience. His victims didn't know they were being hunted. They thought they were living ordinary lives, but in reality, they were part of a cruel experiment. Every detail they shared with him became ammunition. Every laugh and smile, another chain pulling them closer to his trap. Criminologists often say that killers who outsmart their victims are not just violent. They are manipulative psychologists in their own right. The butcher may not have studied textbooks, but his instincts were razor sharp. He knew exactly how to read a person, how to spot loneliness in their eyes or desperation in their voice. And once he identified those weaknesses, he became the solution to them. To the lonely, he became a friend. To the struggling, he became a provider. To the insecure, he became someone who listened. He filled the very voids his victims carried. That is what made him so dangerous. He didn't chase his prey. He allowed them to come closer on their own, believing they had found safety, kindness, even companionship. But in truth, they had only found the next phase of his trap. One by one, his chosen victims began to let him deeper into their lives. They trusted him with their secrets, relied on his generosity, even invited him into their homes at times. He was no longer just their butcher. He was their friend, their confidant, even their protector. But behind every kind word, behind every thoughtful gesture, the butcher's mind was racing with strategy. He was measuring the moment, waiting for the exact point when his victim's dependence on him was strong enough, when their defenses were completely down. And when that moment came, he moved them into the illusion of safety, a carefully designed stage where trust turned deadly. Let's dig deeply into his manipulation of conversations, how he sorted victims like a predator in the wild, the psychology of reading weaknesses, the step-by-step trust-building process, the illusion of safety. Trust, once earned, is the most powerful weapon in the hands of a predator. The butcher knew this better than anyone. By the time he chose his victims, they no longer saw him as just a shopkeeper. They saw him as a friend, a helper, even a small anchor in their daily lives. But the butcher didn't stop at trust. He understood that trust alone wasn't enough. What he needed was comfort. He needed his victims to not only lower their guard, but to willingly step into his world without hesitation. That's where he built what criminologists call the illusion of safety. The safe haven front. The butcher shop itself was his stage. The front of the shop was bright, clean, familiar. The smell of fresh bread, spices, and smoked meat filled the air, reminding customers of home and family dinners. A cheerful bell rang whenever the door opened, and his friendly banter completed the illusion. This space wasn't just about selling meat. It was about creating a psychological safe zone. Customers felt at ease, surrounded by normality. The brighter and friendlier the front appeared, the less anyone suspected what waited beyond. And so, when the butcher occasionally said, "Come to the back, I'll show you something special," his victims rarely hesitated. Why would they? They had stepped behind his counter before. They trusted him. They felt safe. A predator's hospitality. He had other tricks too. Sometimes he offered rare cuts of meat at impossible prices, saying quietly, "I saved this for you. Don't tell anyone else." Victims felt special, chosen, even privileged. This selective generosity wasn't kindness. It was conditioning. It made people believe they had a unique bond with him, something no one else shared. Other times, he presented himself as a protector. If a woman mentioned being afraid to walk home in the dark, he offered a ride. If someone spoke of struggling financially, he slipped them extra meat wrapped in brown paper, whispering, "Don't worry, you can pay me later." Acts of generosity became invisible chains. His victims felt indebted to him, making it even harder to suspect him, creating familiar routines. One of the butcher's most subtle techniques was turning encounters into rituals. He encouraged his victims to stop by at certain times, often after closing hours when no one else was around. What seemed like convenience, skipping the crowd, getting better deals, was actually control. He had carefully engineered situations where they would be alone with him, in his territory, with no one watching. Over time, these private meetings felt normal to his victims. The boundaries blurred. What should have been a red flag instead became routine. This was the brilliance of the butcher's illusion. He made danger feel ordinary. The trap tightens. By now, his chosen victims felt completely comfortable in his presence. They shared personal details, laughed at his jokes, even accepted his advice. He was no longer just their butcher. He was woven into their lives, a character they never questioned. And that was the very point, because when the time came, when he finally decided to act, there would be no struggle at first, no suspicion. His victims wouldn't scream when he asked them to step into the back room. They wouldn't run when he offered them a late-night ride. They would follow him, calmly, willingly, because they believed they were safe. But in reality, the moment they crossed that invisible line, safety was gone. The illusion had done its job. Their trust had blinded them. Their comfort had trapped them. And the butcher was ready for the next phase of his plan, outsmarting suspicion itself. Because killing, for him, wasn't enough. If he wanted to keep playing his game, he had to make sure no one ever suspected him. The front stage, his safe public shop. The manipulation of generosity. How routines became traps. The psychology of illusion of safety. Outsmarting suspicion. No predator can survive without camouflage. Lions have the grass. Owls have the night sky. The butcher had his mask of normalcy. But unlike animals, his greatest threat wasn't prey. It was suspicion. If anyone looked too closely, if anyone connected the dots between his victims and his shop, his game would end. So he became just as skilled at deceiving society as he was at deceiving individuals. The helpful citizen. Whenever someone disappeared, the butcher was there, front and center. He joined search parties, knocking on doors, helping to comb through fields and alleys. He comforted grieving families, sometimes even providing food at no cost during vigils or memorial gatherings. This served two purposes. First, it painted him as a caring, selfless neighbor. Second, it placed him close enough to the investigation that no one would think to question his involvement. After all, who suspects the man handing out free meals to the very people searching for their missing loved ones? Planting doubt. The butcher also knew how to control narratives. He didn't spread wild rumors, just subtle suggestions, casual remarks that cast shadows elsewhere. If a victim had financial troubles, he might say, "They mentioned leaving town for a fresh start." If someone was known to drink, he'd sigh, "They didn't look too well last time I saw them." If they had argued with family, he'd shake his head, "Maybe they needed space." These whispers weren't enough to draw attention to himself, but they planted seeds in the minds of others. Soon, when police or neighbors wondered why someone vanished, the community had ready-made answers. Answers that didn't point to him. The charming interviewee. Even when questioned by authorities, the butcher excelled at keeping suspicion at bay. He was calm, polite, cooperative. He handed over receipts, explained his schedules, and even made small jokes to ease tension. Detectives, overwhelmed with missing person cases, often walked away convinced he was harmless. Criminal psychologists describe this as the camouflage personality. It's not about hiding in shadows. It's about hiding in plain sight by becoming so ordinary, so helpful, so unremarkable that the idea of guilt seems absurd. The cycle continues. And so, the cycle repeated. Another victim gone. Another round of search parties. Another string of sympathetic words from a butcher. He knew how to stay just close enough to the grief to look innocent, but just distant enough to avoid scrutiny. His ability to control suspicion wasn't luck, it was strategy. Every action, every word, Every expression was calculated to keep his mask intact. And for a time, it worked flawlessly. But eventually, even the most perfect camouflage has cracks. A predator can't keep hunting forever without leaving traces. And the butcher's story was no exception. His downfall wasn't the result of a single mistake. It was the slow unraveling of his own overconfidence, the tiny details that began to add up, and the realization that his illusion couldn't hold forever. The final move. For years, the butcher lived behind his mask, manipulating, deceiving, and hunting without consequence. But every game must eventually end, and his downfall was as much psychological as it was practical. The cracks in the mask. The butcher's greatest strength, his control, became his weakness. Over time, he grew too confident. He took greater risks, choosing victims more boldly, speaking with less caution, leaving small inconsistencies in his stories. Neighbors who once admired his generosity began to notice that he always seemed too involved in disappearances. Detectives, while initially convinced of his innocence, began to revisit old interviews and spot subtle contradictions. The illusion he worked so hard to build began to fracture. The survivor's voice. What truly doomed him, however, wasn't evidence alone, it was a voice. One victim, someone he underestimated, managed to escape. Unlike the others, this person sensed the danger too late, but still found an opportunity to flee. Terrified, but alive, they gave investigators the missing piece. Testimony from inside the butcher's carefully hidden world. Their words pulled the curtain back on his entire act. Suddenly, his generosity seemed sinister. His concern appeared staged. His helpful presence at search parties looked like performance. The mask was gone, and the predator was revealed. The community's shock. When the truth finally came out, the town was shaken to its core. This wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. This wasn't an outsider, a drifter, or a name no one knew. This was their butcher, the man they trusted with their food, their conversations, even their secrets. The betrayal was worse than the violence. People struggled to understand how someone so close, so ordinary, could be capable of such horrors. It was a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it smiles, nods, and hands you a paper-wrapped package of meat. The legacy of fear. The butcher's story is more than just the tale of one killer. It is a psychological lesson about trust, manipulation, and the danger of assuming safety. He thrived because people wanted to believe in him. They wanted to believe that kindness was real, that generosity had no strings, that their community was safe. And he exploited that belief until the very end. The final truth. The scariest part of the butcher's story is not that he killed. It's how he killed. Not with rage, not with chaos, but with patience, charm, and calculation. His true weapon was never the knife. It was trust. And that's the lesson his story leaves us with. That sometimes the most dangerous predators are not the ones we fear in dark alleys, but the ones we invite into our lives with open arms. Because evil doesn't always come crashing through the door. Sometimes it waits behind a counter, smiling, and asks, "Would you like the best cut?" For more video like this, subscribe, like, and share our channel. Life Fact Daily.